Access control fundamentals. What do we mean by access control? What does that mean? Well, you can't use the words to define it. Controlling access. Okay, I got it. Now I understand access control is controlling access. What does that mean?
Locking the doors.
Locking the doors? What is access? Who can get there? The ability to get someplace, isn't it? In access control, well, let's see if we can do this think through before we actually go through their 61 slides, which I'll go through relatively quickly. What would be the first thing you would have to have access control? A group or something? But what do you have to do in order to be recognized as a member of the group? Authentication. What do you have to do to get authenticated? Depends. No, you don't have to have depends for that.
We'll let them know that you are who you are.
You let them know that would be identification. Identification would be like your username. And then your username and password, you would get authenticated. And after you got authenticated, then you would get access to the resources that you were supposed to get. And there's a number of ways to do that. They're going to talk about, mandatory access controls. And we kind of have mandatory access controls in here, don't we? Kind of, sort of, or do we? What do you have to do, in order to actually, theoretically anyway, get to one of these computers? Unlock the doors. But what do you got to be? Do we just let anybody we invite to public in say, come on in and use our computers like they do at the library? It's supposed to be a student or staff or instructor. So is that some sort of a mandatory control, something that you and I don't have any real control over? What about at the library? Do they have mandatory access control? You have to have a library card, so they do have some sort of control on that. And they probably have some sort of, we're talking about discretionary access control. Discretionary means that you can give me permission to use or see a resource. You can right-click on the printer and share it to me. You can right-click on a folder and share it to me as long as you have the authority to do that. So we have mandatory and discretionary access controls. And they talk about role-based. There is in NetWare, which is a true X.500 directory service, a role object to where you put people in there after you give the access, put them in the discretionary access control list. They become the access control entries, all those really good terms that Microsoft likes to use. You can do the same thing effectively in Microsoft by making a group and giving the group the access to the resources and then putting users in the group and taking users out of the group as you want to modify them. So with that kind of startup, I think we covered the whole subject, haven't we? Sort of at least. Access control fundamentals. The objectives. Define access control and list 4 access control models. We got 3 of them, didn't we? 3 of the 4 models. Describe logical access control methods. We got logical access control, physical access control. At the end of the chapter, they talk about physical access control, which is locking the buildings, putting on deadbolts, those sorts of things. Explain the different types of physical access control, what we can do to do that. Access control. In Sam's definition, controlling access, the process by which resources or services are granted or denied on a computer system or a network. And it doesn't really have to be on a computer system or a network. What about access control, physical access control? Where can you go in some buildings? We don't have our bankers here, so where can they go in their bank? Probably only where they're supposed to be. Where can you go in this building? Can you go everywhere in this building? If the door's not locked, so that's some sort of access control. What about the knock? You're not supposed to. Can you generally just walk into it? Can you generally during the day, during class hours, just walk into a classroom? Yeah, because it's unlocked. But we have some sort of access control, or should have at least some sort of access control on the knock. Once you got in there, would there be other controls? We certainly hope so. So this is not the only thing. 4 standard models, as well as specific practices used to enforce access control. And we talked about identification. A user accessing a computer system would present his credentials or identification, such as a username, and then would be authenticated with a password, with a combination of those two. We would get on the resource. Same thing kind of happens when you try to go someplace, doesn't it, if you're trying to go to work? And probably should with your badge. What if we all of a sudden decided to enforce all this badging requirement? What could we do to control access? Put little things on the back of them. We could have them scannable because they got barcodes on them. We could have them scannable, which automatically operated the door, or we could put James back there at the door and check everybody's badge as they came in. $5. $5. Did they ever do that on base? You ever do that when you guys were coming back in the military on and off base? Huh? Huh? You were working the checkpoint. So you were checking for the identification, look at the ID card to see if picture matched, and that's really what you were looking at for those, weren't you? Huh? Checked it a few times. On the base, depending on, and we have the security levels, how much security do we actually want? How much do we actually need? We did the same thing on ships, and you checked it a lot closer in foreign ports than you did in the U.S. ports because you felt that the threat level was higher there. So some sort of credentials to identify yourself. Authentication is checking the user's credentials to be sure that they are authenticated and not fabricated. So if Robert was out there working the checkpoint, somebody came up with an ID card. If I gave Kevin my ID card and he came up and Kevin presented these credentials, you're going to look and say, hey, these guys don't look the same. So then you wouldn't be authenticated because the credentials didn't match. And then if the credentials matched, back to the checkpoint, checking the ID card, if the credentials matched, if my picture was on the identification and I got authenticated, I'd be authorized, I could go through the gate. In this one, you're authorized, you get onto the computer system. But once you get on the computer system, do you have access to everything that's on the machine or everything that's on the network? For instance, Chris, can you get into Will's home directory?
Shouldn't be able to.
Shouldn't be able to. Have you ever tried?
No.
Can you? I have too. Me too. I can't either. But some users can't because they have more authorization, a higher level of authorization. That user would be like an administrative user. A member of the administrators group, we'll get there in a second, has different authorizations. So different users have different authorizations. There's a color laser printer around here somewhere. Can you print to it? I can't either. There's a printer in the library. Can you print to it? Me too. Authorization, because we're authorized to use that resource. Computer users granted access to only certain services or applications in order to perform their duties. And this is what people should get access to. What if they get access to too many places? And I think later on they're talking about people say, oh, you don't trust me. Could be. Could be. But what if we trusted everybody to get everything that they wanted and then somebody got your Social Security number? Huh? It's okay as long as it's not yours, right? If it's somebody else's, it's okay. It's not a big deal. But it gets right down personal whenever it's your credentials or your identification that somebody's compromised. I mean, just something simple like that. Do we not trust people? The answer is kind of. We don't. And if you hadn't read James's week 4 discussion, right, about the ActiveX. It's a very good, read that. It's very, very good. ActiveX and Java. And why do we not trust people to install ActiveX controls? Yeah, and the clickies. Hey, he's picked up on my terminology. I think. That's good. And Devin wrote about the clickies. Let's just say, okay, it's okay. Let's just take everything. You're about to do something really stupid. Okay, let's do it. How many of you took the certificate that Kane offered you without looking? If you look at it, it's kind of interesting who it's issued to, star.ecpi.edu. I don't think you can issue a wildcard in a certificate. That's the key. The certificate's got to be issued to an individual resource. Why do these things pop up? Because there's something wrong with them. But should you trust all of your users to do everything? A lot of students go out to do internships or get jobs in small companies, and they come back and say, you know, everybody's an administrator. Sometimes on their local computer, sometimes people are administrators. Everybody's an administrator on the network. Whoa! Yeah, the whole network. Huh? A lot more work for you, because if you're an administrator and you're logged on as administrator, and please, when you are administrators, only log on as administrator. When you're doing administrative work, probably told you the story, but a few years ago, many years ago, when we were still in NetWare, there was an instructor who was an administrator on the NetWare network. And this was during the days of the I Love You virus. And he got an email from a legitimate corporate email address, which means that somebody had compromised the address books. Could not resist finding out who at another location loved him. And since he was an administrator, you know how far his damage went? He damaged the whole server. If he had not been an administrator, how far would the damage have gone? All the way to his home directory, instead of wiping out the whole server. So be really careful about those things whenever you are an administrator. Only use those credentials, that authority, when you actually need that. That's what the run as the secondary logons are for, so that you can run these different tools and applications as an administrator without actually being logged on. Table that's in the book, identification, authentication, authorization, and access. We're going to be eventually talking about a lot about the AAA, which half of you did and the other half did the CIA. Computer access control accomplished by one of 3 entities, hardware, software, or policy. How are we going to control the access, depending on the resources that are being protected? Other terminology, object, subject, and operation, and they go through these. Object is the object. When you look in Windows, what's an object if you're controlling access to an object? What's an object? File, folder, printer. Kind of represents a resource. Subject is the user, and the operation of what you can do to that object. Access control terminology, role, we have owners, custodians, and the end user. Owner is the person responsible for the information. Generally, the owner is going to be the user that created the object. If you create a folder, you're going to be the owner of that folder. The interesting thing about that, and you can play with that one, try it sometime, is create a folder and then take out everybody. Remove all users, including the everyone, the defaults, and the domain and all that other stuff. And they'll tell you you're about to do something really stupid. Do you want to do this? Just say yes. Then try to get into it with your administrator authority. And it's going to tell you you don't have access. You don't have access, but you do have the authority to grant access. So all you do is go back and give yourself access to that resource. I think I told you the story about the student who was here, and then they were moving from one server. They were moving from server 2000 to server 2003. and they move their payroll by backing it up and restoring it. When they restored it, the problem was the credentials in the restore belonged to the old domain. So now they've just locked themselves out of their payroll database. How you fix that? He called me up and said, I know you told us how to do this, but I forgot. All you do is go in and give yourself, right-click, give yourself, because you're the owner, administrator, whoever restored it's the owner. The owner can always grant access. That's why there is a permission to take ownership. You can give somebody permission to take ownership, but you can't give ownership and shouldn't give ownership. Custodian, individual to whom day-to-day actions have been assigned by the owner. In this case, we could give custodian if we created a folder, we the administrator created a folder, and let's say we wanted Devin to control access to that folder, then we would give him the authority to grant others access or delegation of control in Active Directory, something like that. The end user, you and I, just like the printer up there, can we print to the color printer? We're the end users and we can't do it. There are some end users that can print to it. Who's going to control access? The owner, in this case, the network administrator does that. He has not delegated somebody as the custodian in order to be able to grant access to those resources. This is the one that they talk about in the book, getting access to the file. And remember, in Windows, you can give access to folders and it gets inherited, or you can give access permissions to individual files. You cannot share individual files. You can only share folders, but you can control permissions on individual files. So this one just then, this is just a subject, end user, owner, what permissions can they give, and what they do in here is give one of the users the authority to actually change the, in this case, the salary spreadsheet, and give somebody else the authority to read the salary spreadsheet. What else should you do? I think you should do, if you have a salary anything, should be able to do auditing to see who actually is looking at it, who actually made changes. Some cases you want to know successes, some cases you want to know failures, some cases you want to know both. And in this one, I think you'd do both. Who's trying to get there to make changes and who actually made changes when something comes up. Access control model, a predefined framework for hardware and software developers who need to implement access control in their devices or applications. We'll pick on James a minute here because he's a programmer. Do you set up some sort of access control in the programs? What the program can access, what it can't access, who can do what to the program itself? He's going to tell me no.
Actually, there's a way I can bypass UAC and everything.
Bypass UAC and everything. Yeah.
But as far as programming something, no. A lot of stuff's protected by username and password. Most commercial software, like say for games or something, you gotta have a unique.
You gotta have a unique credential.
Yeah. But for something like I do, I don't know.
Yeah, but they are out there. What kind of access control do we have to these things? What kind of access control do we set up for the programs to have? Well, ActiveX. Let's go back to ActiveX. What kind of access control does ActiveX get? Full control. Based on? Based on clicking, depending on the policy, whether you're allowed to install that. But it gets the authority of the user that's running the program, does it not? That's one of my arguments for don't be an administrator out there, because if you don't have the authority to install it, that can be a good thing.
I refuse to install it. Even on the syllabus page, it asks for one. For Microsoft 2007 Office. I refuse to install it.
Once a model is applied, the custodians can configure the security based on the requirements of the owner. So we're going to set up a framework for this is what we're going to do, and then the custodian, whoever is responsible, becomes responsible for carrying out those that guidance. Mandatory access control, the end user cannot implement, modify, or transfer any controls. We kind of have that, don't we? Can you modify? Can you Can you implement, modify, or transfer controls on these machines? Somebody else set up the permissions. And these mandatory access controls, and I think they say, are generally government-oriented. And what you think of, and the one that I was trying to get the image of, is that you've got to be a student to get into here, be mandatory access control. The mandatory is that you should be an employee or a student here in order to use the resource. Once you get on the resource, you go through the other types of access control. The owner and custodian are responsible for managing the access controls. Most restrictive because all of the controls are, in fact, fixed. The original Mac, all the objects and subjects were assigned a numeric access code, and we had different levels of access that could be used in these things. The access level of the subject had to be higher than the object in order for access to be granted. And if you go back into the military, since we have some of these guys here, we have 3 basic classifications, 4 basic we use unclassified. Unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret. If you have an unclassified clearance, what kind of access control do you have? What kind of access do you have? You can read the newspaper. I mean, that would be unclassified, right? And then we have confidential, which would be a little bit higher. And each of these have the structure that they set up based on the damage that this material can do. Till you get up to secret, top secret. Actually, I missed top secret, didn't I? Can somebody with a top secret clearance get access to secret material? Sure, as long as the access level is higher than what you're trying to get to. And there's also a need to know thing in there, but just the access control levels, as long as you have a higher level, you could get to that. Discretionary access control list is the least permissive. Discretionary access control is if you or I created a folder and right-clicked on it and shared it and said, oh, we want to give Sam or we want to give the whole class access to this folder. That's a discretionary access control. Subject has total control over any objects that he or she owns, so we could give access to that. By the way, in the Windows world, you have to have full control to the object in order to share the object. So if you have modify, it's not going to happen. You need full control. We've had people years ago did that, and actually one of our former network administrators who's running a network someplace else sent me an email one time and said, this guy's going to come to interview, and I remember him for some reason, but I don't remember why. Thought, said, oh yeah, he was part of the famous access cheating ring. What happened was they had one guy who knew how to run access, so what he would do the problems and then share his home directory with all of his buddies, discretionary access control. And then they would use his work and submit it. Except there's only a problem because they get stamped with who did it. But guy never showed up for the interview, so you never know how far back these things will go to you. Said he never showed up for the interview. I guess it finally dawned on him who he was being interviewed by. And he was the instructor for that class. I probably wouldn't show up either. I don't know about you. Discretionary access control, the subject can also change the permissions for the other subjects over the objects, depending on how much control you want to give to everybody else. It's kind of like just the example I just gave. They right-click, they shared their home directories. What could we do as the network administrators to prevent that? Don't give them full control. Do you actually need full control to your home directory? I mean, you can do everything except share, I think, with modify, can you? With the modify permission. Huh? Let's find out. I'm not sure what your permissions are. You probably do have full control. I don't really know. User access control, something that's new that I think probably has helped new in Windows, been in Linux for a number of years. I believe, right, Linux guys? Which says that if you're trying to do something to modify the operating system, it's going to say, did you do that? And in Windows, they made it really convenient. Actually, Vista, this was one of the things that people love to hate about Vista. It's one of those things, give me a secure operating system, and they did, and they said, oh, we didn't really mean that. It's too much trouble. Linux doesn't just allow you to click and say OK, and you can configure Windows to either require credentials or to click and say OK, depending on the groups that the users are in. Linux actually makes you put in credentials every time, doesn't it, the super user? Every time you want to do something to modify it. So what this does is protecting us from ourselves. And this is another one. If it pops up in user access control and you didn't start something, you may want to think about it before you say OK. Three restrictions, user access control run with limited privileges is the default, and that's how you should be running if you're running Vista or in Windows 7. Applications run in standard user accounts. Standard users perform common tasks. So these are the things that you should do. If you have a regular user, because if you guys try to install something on these computers, what happens?
We get the finger.
You get the finger. What you actually get is a window that pops up and says, put in your credentials. Same thing. No, it's not. And what kind of credentials do you got to put in? Somebody has the authority to do that. Somebody that has a higher degree of authority than the requirement to do this install. You have to be an administrator in order to do that. So you have to at least have administrative authority on the local machine or in the domain. Inheritance is to automatically reduce the user's permissions, discretionary access control. Role-based, we talked about a little bit. Role-based, they talk about the real world, and when you talk about permissions and giving permissions, if you have a position that people, come and go, and you don't want to have to go through that individual every time and give permissions, set up a role and let them occupy the role whenever they're doing that. An example I used to use is, and I know Monty had these coffee messes. Were you ever treasurer? Coffee mess treasurer? It rotates around. What usually happens is whoever is absent one day of work gets elected to treasurer because nobody wants to take care of it. But if we changed that role frequently, would you want to have to go in and change the permissions? You got to go into one user and take all the permissions away on this list, whatever it is. And then you got to go in and give the permissions to a different user. What if we just made a role object if we were using an operating system that had a role object? Or in Windows, since it does in a group called treasurer, and then when somebody got elected, we put them in. And when they got unelected, we take them out. So that without having to go through all of the changes, we can actually change permissions. And I know I talked about, anyway, in the Windows class, when you delegate control in Active Directory to reset passwords, kind of a pain because how many people forget their passwords on a daily basis? Probably 5 or 6%. Do you as a network administrator want to have to do every single password reset? Particularly if you're here at night and you're not here at night and somebody, night student forgets their password, now what are you going to do? We're going to have Lyzina drive in from Floyd to change password, reset a password. Probably not. So we delegate that authority to some central location like the librarian. Well, what happens when the librarian changes?
It works.
Because you have full control. What happens when the librarian changes?
You got to put somebody else in there.
You got to put somebody else in there. What if we didn't make the group or didn't have a role for that reset password? You got to go take it away from the old one, and they'll give it to the new one. But if we had the role or if we had the group and it changed, we just put the new one in and take the old one out. So you shared your home directory, so now we got to go fix that, huh? How can we fix that? Change the default permission for those things. Rule-based access control, rule-based and role-based, we have certain rules. Automated provisioning, dynamically assign roles to the subjects based on the set of rules that they define. So you log in, and based on who you log in as, you get made, based on the rules, you get access to something. We kind of did a rule-based something in Windows, didn't we? You were supposed to anyway.
With the conditional forwarding?
No. Conditional forwarding would kind of be rule-based, but what about denying an application? Application control. Was that rule-based?
With the group policy.
With a group policy, was that rule-based?
Yeah, it could be.
Could be.
If you're this person, if you're not this person,
Then you can't do it, or if you are this person, you can, depending on how you set up the defaults. So rule-based, each resource contains a set of access properties based on a number of rules that we use. Often used for managing user access to one or more systems. So in mandatory access control, discretionary, role-based, and rule-based. And did they ask those on the Security Plus, Adam? Mandatory? Yeah. I know they asked mandatory and discretionary. Did they talk about rule-based? I don't recall rule-based on mine. Role-based. They talk about role-based, discretionary, and mandatory, or at least that's what I recall from it. Other ways to do the separation of duties. In a small organization, an individual's probably going to do a whole lot of stuff. And that's kind of dangerous. Single point of failure. Also single point of compromise. Single point of stealing all the money. One of the ways that you prevent that is separation of duties. The easiest example of that would probably be backup and restore of a server, where you would have, we'd say that Will can back up the servers, but he can't restore the information, so that he couldn't back it up and then take it to some other server and restore it and then say, oh, yeah, I'm gonna get all this information. So we allow Will to back up and James maybe to restore the things that Will back up. So separation of duties, each user or each individual is assigned part of the responsibility of an entire task, so that anybody can't do the whole thing. The other one is job rotation, and this is one that the military is kind of big on. And I don't know if it's on purpose. Well, it's not inadvertent. It is on purpose that you rotate people around so that somebody else comes into the job and you get an auditing because you now know if the person before them was doing the job properly. So you get that by job rotation instead of one person doing it all the time. And that's what happens on a lot of these embezzlements. And if somebody's been the treasurer for this thing for 30 years and they never did an audit, and nobody knows they've been taking out $1,000 a month or $1,000 a week, putting it in their own private account, because they've been there forever. There's no job rotation. Job rotation can help in the security of these things. It's not always practical, but it's there. Least privilege. Minimal amount of privilege is necessary to perform his or her job function. This is where people say, you don't trust me. And if you're a pain like me, you say, yes, you're right. I don't trust anybody. And if you're a security professional, how much trust should you have? I mean, the people that are seemingly the most trusting, oh, yeah, that'd be social engineering, wouldn't it?
You can trust but verify.
Huh? Trust but verify. There's an old saying that the old admiral said, that you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And there's a lot to that true. Trust but verify, exactly. Trust but verify, what does that mean, Adam? It means I don't trust you.
Don't really trust you.
But I'm going to act like I do.
Right.
And that's where, how can you do those things? Implicit deny. Implicit deny, you never thought that was going to come back after we talked about NTFS permissions, did you? What does implicit deny mean? It means that what James just did, He just gave Will, or did you give everybody access to it? Just gave Will. So can any of the rest of you get onto James's home directory? Huh? Implicit deny. He gave it to Will, but he didn't give it to Sam. Sam can't get there. The implicit deny is you give permissions to one user or a group of users and don't give it to the other ones, then that implies that you only meant it for that group of users, so they can't get there. It's also a much safer way to deny access because an explicit deny, where you check the deny box, the only way to get it back is to go uncheck that box. Logical access control, physical access control, logical access control. To implement access controls are divided into two categories. The physical is kind of obvious, lock the doors, cameras, guards with guns, guards without guns, security alarms. Logical access control is logical, the access that we use. Logical access control lists. They've got an example here of a couple of access control lists. What was it? Did James just create an access control list whenever he shared his home directory and violated a school policy, I believe, with Will? Did he create an access control list? Who was allowed access control? Will was. So he had this list, and we have one access control entry is going to be the next thing they talk about. And that access control entry was Will's username. The access control entries are just the list, the users that go in the list. Other access control lists, what about routers? Were there access control lists there? Could you control access? And we would do that. We talked about firewalls and filter routers and DMZs a little earlier. How do we prevent everybody from having access to everything in the DMZ? We have a filter router, and in the filter router, what do? We put an access control list in there and say, hey, anybody can get to port 80. Anybody can get to port 443. And if we didn't give access, explicit access, then everything else is denied. Because that's the way Cisco works, at least. There's an implicit, an implied, and implicit deny at the end of the access control list. So you have to permit at least one thing. So logical groups of policies, account restrictions, and passwords, all the things that we can do that everybody that's done Active Directory, hopefully, and the server classes hopefully have done. Account restrictions, what time of day can you log on? Can you log on at any time of day? What kind of restrictions are there? Passwords, how long do the passwords have to be? How often do you have to change them? Access control list, permissions. Did you give him read or did you give him full control of your, huh? Gave him read so that he could get those tests. Well, you do that anyway on your server. When you do the projects, you share the information with, you probably share it with everybody because you use a web entity, huh? Email it to somebody, but you can do those things. Open viewed in relation to the files maintained. Says the structure of the access is relative as a bit complex could be. The access control entry is who actually goes on the access control list. Each of the operating systems looks a little different. Does this look familiar to you Linux guys? Group. They got group mask. What Linux uses is, I came up with my own acronym for it, which is UGA. User, group, and all others, right? Those are the way that permissions are grouped in Linux. And what you have? Read, write, and execute. RWX. Yeah. So we can do those. This is kind of what they look like. The mask down here is what they can do, and the mask is going to be set up in binary, right? And 777, I cheat. I use 777 when I want to do something because that's everything to everybody. Huh?
You don't have to use the numbers.
You don't have to use the numbers if you use the GUI.
Like, you can change mod and user plus U plus whatever you want.
Networking properties, a Windows access control list is going to be a GUI, the clickies. And if it's, remember, if it's grayed out, it's inherited and you can't change inherited properties. We have allow and deny. If we click the deny, that is an explicit deny. The only way to take away an explicit deny in Windows is go back and take it away, uncheck it. If you once give a deny, it's denied regardless of what else you do. 4 items, and these are kind of specific, and I think they get covered in the Windows classes. The security identifier, the SID, an access mask that specifies the access rights, and then they used the wrong term here, didn't they? For giving access to an object. What should be the term? Huh? How about permissions? Rights are what you can do to the, in Windows, rights are what you can do to the computer. Can you change the desktop? Can you change the IP address? On and on and on and on. Permissions are what you can do to the resources. Can you get to James's home directory? And once you get there, can you make changes? Can you save stuff to it, or can you just read? That's what we're talking about here, the mask for the access permissions controlled by the access control entry. If you were using NetWare, it would be rights. Microsoft kind of marches to their own tune. A flag indicates the type of access control entry, and the set of flags determine whether the objects can inherit the permissions. And we can turn that on or off in Microsoft. You can turn that on or off depending on how you mask it in NetWare. So can they be, what are they, who's there, what are they, and can they be inherited is what we're really talking about in these things. Group policies. Microsoft think group policies, how we control through Active Directory. And they say a feature that provide a Microsoft Windows feature that provides management. You can also set policies with other operating systems, NetWare specifically, which seems to be dying, but is still a lot of installs around worldwide, not so much in the U.S. But this allows us to control what users can do, the rights, what users can do to the computers. For instance, can you change the IP address on these computers, on these desktops? I don't think you can. Can you change the proxy server settings in Internet Explorer? That's a policy that we control with Active Directory. Do you have the shutdown button? I won't ask can you shut down the computer, because if you know enough, you can shut it down. Do you have the shutdown button? Not anymore, because policy turned it off. Can you shut down the computer?
Yeah.
How? Command line.
Or you can go to task manager.
Oh, you go to task manager. So it needs to change the policy, right? Group policy is usually using the enterprise environments to restrict the actions of the users, and they say security risk, also annoyance risks. Years ago, before we had policies, George Van Dyke, who's retired from here, used to probably spend every afternoon, and we went 5 days a week, so every afternoon, 5 days a week, undoing things that users had done during classes. Some on purpose, some because they just didn't know what they were doing. Some were just bored. That's probably true. Writing viruses. We had some students that were writing viruses. A long time ago, yeah. The one that I love is just the batch file in DOS, the batch file. That when you start up, you run this batch file at the command line. So this computer is infected with a virus. Shut it down immediately. It's really not. But it's effective as a denial of service, isn't it? If they shut it down immediately and don't use the computer, then you've denied the service. True? Entertaining. But what this does is kind of protect you from your users, and in some cases protect you from yourself. What can or can't your users do? Can your users delete these really important files? And actually Windows has done a little bit with that, because they have copies of those. If you delete something inadvertently, then it comes right back. What I always thought was interesting, did you know that Solitaire was an essential Windows file? Go to Windows XP and delete the sol.exe. What happens? Comes right back. cache DLLs. And it's one of the cache DLLs. I mean, some of the things are just kind of interesting as to what is there. So I used to have a lab in, well, Windows 2000 you could actually just delete it and it would be okay. But in Windows XP they made it part of the cache DLLs, the critical Windows files. So the first time we did this lab said do this, and they deleted it and it dutifully came right back. So how can you do those things? What can you do with them? Group policy objects are stored in. Group policy settings are stored in the group policy objects. And group policy because they group the policies together. There's no real thing there. Account restrictions, we'll go through these, but these are more specific to the Windows courses, I think. We go through these in some detail. But time of day restrictions, when can users log on? If you want users that work nights not to be able to log on at day, or day users not to be able to log on at night, then you can do this. And I think the next chapter has the story about the French bank that lost $6 or $7 billion in fraudulent trades because they weren't following their policy. So they had a trader that would come in on weekends and disguise his trades. What he would do would be come in and what they did was a thing called arbitrage, where they sell a set of stocks and then they buy a set of stocks and they make money on the difference in the price and the bid and the ask, and one's always higher than the other one. But what he would do would come in and correct his stuff, and he would say that he had sold a bunch of stuff that didn't exist. But by being there on weekends and doing those things, he was actually violating the policies and the controls that they'd set up. All this stuff was logged. They just didn't read the logs. So how would you like to be responsible for a $7.5 billion loss for your company? How long is it going to take you to pay that back?
I would like to be the first guy doing it.
Huh?
I would like to be the first guy doing it.
No, but you're not. You're the network administrator. The trader was the one that was doing it. The network administrator, the security administrator, was the one that wasn't following the policies and following the controls that were set up. Account expiration, if you have temporary files, you may want to do that. You may want to set them up so that you have temporary workers and they go away so that those accounts don't remain active. We probably should do that with students, right? Set up your account expiration when you should actually graduate. What would that do for us? I told you, sometimes you get into, and when I first was a network administrator, we had like 300 students and 712 accounts. I don't remember what it was, but the numbers were something like that. If we have 350 extra accounts, we have 350 threats that are available. What if the accounts are disabled at a particular time? And this generally, they talk about this in terms of temporary workers. Time of day, when can users log on? Somebody's here working from midnight to 1 on Sundays. Or actually, that's blocked. They're not working from midnight to 1 on Sundays. This is backwards of what you would usually see on Windows, because the dark area would be the one when you could, and the light area would be the one when you couldn't. This actually is probably a network. Oh, this is parental control. It is Windows. It's kind of what network looks like. This is in the Linksys Internet Access Control. When can users get through the switch, through the router? When do you want to allow users on? Just one of the steps that, yep, if you're there and you don't want people doing things at midnight or whatever else, you can do those things. You can control when they can and when they can't. Passwords, they go through a relatively long. Password should never be written down, must be sufficient length and complexity so that the attacker cannot easily guess it. And these are kind of, I think, contradictory here. Should never be written down, but let's make a really good password. How do you do that? Passphrases are typically a good way to do that. A phrase and use letters out of the phrases, special characters. Special characters will really help except when we get into the next one, they talk about rainbow tables, and it doesn't really matter. Something that would take a brute force program 6 times 10 to the 12th years takes rainbow tables 28 minutes, regardless of how long it is. Brute force, trying to guess the password, and then the hash. What brute force is do with the hash is it goes through every possible iteration of the hash. The longer the password, the longer it's going to take to go through the hash. So it tries all of the possibilities. And I think that you can kind of see that in that cane too, for those of you, like 4 or 5 of you who have done it. It goes through this is how long does this take and how long does that take. It's not a complex lab, but it demonstrates what goes on in these things. A dictionary attack, all rainbow tables in this one. Dictionary attack, dictionary words. What most of these things in rainbow tables just creates all the possibilities and then goes through all the hash possibilities that are already there. It doesn't generate them as it goes. It takes a long time to generate the table, so it's kind of sort of doing what a brute force, it is a brute force attack, what a brute force is doing, except the brute force attack generates them as it goes. Rainbow tables, you can download them or generate the tables and already have all the possibilities, and then it just does the comparison. It's a lot faster than a brute force. What many of them are doing now is a hybrid attack where it goes through the list and checks to see if the password contains any portion of a dictionary word. If that's the case, then it has that part cracked, and then it goes back and does brute force for what's left over. And they're just hashing the file server. And we've looked at hashes before, I think, hashing algorithms. And there is in that web quest a little application if you want to run to see what a hash looks like. All a hash is a fixed length string of gibberish, something like this, based on the contents of the unencrypted file. And if anything changes, and that includes going from an uppercase to a lowercase letter, then the hashes won't match. Rainbow tables take some time, can be used repeatedly to attack the password. Once you get the tables created, Roger Farmer was downloading them. When he got them done, I think he said they were like 9 gig. At one time, it was illegal, and it's not anymore, illegal to have those tables. But they're there, and I think Cain and Abel, I know Cain and Abel has, one of the options is to crack the password with rainbow tables, but you've got to generate the tables if you want to look at that. This is the how long does it take, 8-digit password of all letters, A, B, C, D, F, G, 1.6 days. Maximum time of rainbow tables, 28 minutes. You notice all of the rainbow tables are 28 minutes. It already generated all the possibilities. They're there. It takes, again, back to the slide before, it takes some time to do that. 9-digit password with with letters and numbers, uppercase, lowercase, and numbers. 378 years. Now, these maximum time using brute force are going to depend on the processing power of the computer, how fast it can do these things. And they don't say, and I didn't see in the book, what kind of machine they were basing this on. 10-digit password, 23,000 years. 14-digit password, 6 times 10 to the 12th years. But in any case, rainbow tables, 28 minutes. How do they get these passwords? How old are Microsoft uses hashes, and this is the NTLM and the LM hashes. And they're all there, and if you look at Cain and Abel, they had NTLM and LAN management hashes. The LM hashes are much easier to crack. By default, Windows caches those hashes. There's a policy you can turn that off so that you don't have them available. A random number, and I want you to listen to this because I had a night student say, I don't recall ever hearing the term salt. And it was on was it on your Security Plus? So the term salt means it's a random characters that are put in when you create the password hashes. Linux uses salts, Windows doesn't use salts. makes the brute force dictionary and rainbow table attacks more difficult because there's, in addition to the password and the algorithm, there's assault in there to do those things. Strong password policy can provide several defenses against password attacks. Strong password policy should be something that you have, obviously. Create and use strong passwords. What makes a password strong? The length of it? Is that it? Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. Is that a good password? Contains words from the dictionary. Even, I mean, it probably would be, I mean, it's long, but is it good? What else should we have in there? Numbers, special characters. One of the things that is kind of interesting is you can use ASCII characters. Kind of a pain to do, the alt number pad, but makes it more difficult to crack. Rainbow tables to prevent the attacker from capturing the password hashes. How are we going to prevent that? And this goes back to some of the things that I think that hopefully we've talked about. Configuration controls. How are you going to get these password hashes? And they're going to go through here, and I'll be able to click through, hopefully, these slides that say, oh, Windows locks these files. They're in 3 different locations, but Windows locks these files. So if Windows is running, you can't get to them. What if I boot to a Linux CD? What if I boot to a Rainbow Table CD? How are we going to prevent that? In the BIOS, don't let people boot to those things. Configuration control and access control. Lock the door. Don't let people get to the machines. If they get to the machines, don't let them boot their CDs, DVDs, so that they can run these programs, because there is a copy of the Windows hash stored in the directory system that's moderately easy to get to. And there are lots of programs out there that will crack the hashes for you. Domain password policy, and those are the ones that you see. How often do you have to change your password? How long does it have to be? How long do you have to keep it? Has anybody ever changed your password and said, oops, I don't like that one, I want to change it again right now? Got to wait a couple of days. I think 5 days minimum password age, so that you can't just cycle the password around. Physical access control, prevent unauthorized users, and this is one that we can probably go through relatively quickly. Fundamental step in physical security is to secure the system itself. And these A+ guys say we're going to lock the case, and that's a good idea. Lock the case. Lock the room, lock the case. Because if we did set the BIOS to not allow bootable CDs and DVDs, how hard is it for somebody that knows what they're doing to fix that? Not very. All you got to do is go in, reset the BIOS, and then you're back to the defaults. What can we prevent that with? Now we come into the physical security area. Configuration security and physical security. Rack-mounted servers, instead of using desktop boxes to do that, so that if somebody did like they did in Australia, probably about 4 years ago, just walked in, picked the servers up, and walked out with them, get a lot of time to attack them then. If they're mounted in racks, makes them more difficult, takes more time in order to actually get to the server. So rack mounted can actually help in those. And the servers back there are rack mounted. Configuration port, this is a KVM switch where you only have to have one keyboard, one mouse, and one monitor for all your machines. Helps in a number of areas. One is just the physical space it would take to have keyboards and mice for all of the servers that you might have. For another one, you have to buy the resources, and it helps in with the heat. Another thing that it can help in is many of these things have passwords that you have to put in on the KVM switch before you can actually see and use the keyboard itself, so you can get locked out that way. And ours locks itself out. so that the mouse and keyboard just don't work on some of the machines some of the times. It's not real wild about the USB configuration on some of the servers. Door security, preset locks like the locks we have, the key lock like you probably have at home. Unlocking these things. Deadbolt. Probably most of you have a key set lock, a lock and a deadbolt on your doors at home. Consider that on some of the other things. How are you going to set up your knock? Deadbolt? What are you going to do? What kind of controls do you have? How much security do you actually need on these things? Inspect the locks on a regular basis. Issue keys only to authorized persons. And this is kind of like pre-shared keys, isn't it? What's to prevent you from going out and get a copy of the key mate? Unless you use one of those Medico locks. You ever seen one of those things? You don't make copies of those keys.
Do not copy. Do not duplicate.
Do not duplicate. Yeah, they have those. You ever taken one of those over to Lowe's and say, here, I need a copy of that? I said, no, oh, that's okay, it's mine. Do they care? Get their $5. They should care, but do they? I think the answer is probably no. And if they did, somebody else wouldn't. But who gets the keys? And this all goes back to you got to trust some of the people. You got to trust somebody eventually. Keep track of keys. One of the things, did you guys have key lockers? What's the key locker? It's a little cabinet with the keys to everything. Because what happens if let's say that on a Saturday morning, somebody actually does need to get into the knock and there's nobody here with a key. How do you do that? If you got a key locker, you would have a key to each space and it would be locked up. Somebody, and that key would be someplace else, but somebody would obviously have to have the key to that. So keep track of the keys. Master keys shouldn't have any mark identifying them as masters, so that they're not the point of interest. So do not duplicate. Wipe out serial numbers to keep duplicates from being ordered. And these would be on the Medico locks. We used to use those on the ships, and the only problem I had with them was that the keys had so much on them that they broke pretty easy. But they are good locks if you ever want one. Cipher locks, and these are pretty simple cipher locks. What's the problem with the cipher lock here? Not that many different combinations. What else? Looking at this thing. What about shoulder surfing? If I just stand there and watch you, punch it in. And some of them have even fewer. So there are a number of them that just have 3 selections instead of the 5. 5 gives you, this has 5, right? 5 gives you a little bit more. One of the things to do on that is a lot of times you see the electrical ones that have the 3 or 4 keys that you push down. People mount them low a lot of times. Probably should be high where people can't watch what you're doing.
A lot of vehicles are available for something.
Yeah. To do those things. Boy. Basic models, and they can be. These things can be any of the cipher locks that are pretty good can be relatively expensive. One of the issues with that. Tailgate sensor, multiple infrared beams that are aimed across the doorway and positioned so the person walks through the doorway. Some beams are activated and the other beams are activated a short time later so that you know that somebody actually came through. Can detect if a second person walks through the beam immediately behind or tailgates on the first person. Then they talk about later on the man trap. Man trap is just where you go through 2 sets of doors so that you go through the first one and people. And what they talk about in the book is they call it a man trap because you came up to Robert and presented your credentials and you go through the first door and then he checks to see if the credentials match. And if they don't, you're trapped because you're between 2 doors in a holding area. That's how it gets its name of the man trap. And if they're good, then you open the other door and let them through. Similar thing here, except we're just trying to sense if somebody's tailgating or walking through with somebody else who has the authority. And that's what people do a lot of times with these cipher locks. We used to have one in the Navy that I worked in a building, and the parking lot was on the other side of the building. It was a different organization that had these cipher locks, and what people from our organization would do is just go stand there and wait till somebody punched in, either watch to see what it was, or somebody would tell them when they changed. Oh, it changes so you can get through the parking lot. And they just walk through right behind them. How much security do you need? Is that important to you? It may or may not be. ID badges, the thing that we had at RFID tags, we kind of had that at Blue Ridge, but what we had was badges that scanned, that had a sensor that you got scanned, and your badge gave you entrance, but it also gave you access as to where you would go. We were in the were in the basement of one of the buildings, which is a lot closer to the parking lot. People didn't have to walk down, 4 steps or something like that. But they couldn't get to the basement. You had to work there or be in IT. IT could get anywhere. So they always want to get on the elevator. The elevator actually had a scanner on it that some of the buttons didn't work based on what was in your badge. So what do you need? How complex of a system do you need? Kind of interesting on that one, the guy that put it in actually got caught stealing stuff with his own security system.
Yeah. You think you know what they're going.
You would think so, wouldn't you? And they talk about RFID tags are there. Man traps, we've talked about. This is a really good rendering of a man trap, right? 2 doors and a hallway. That's what you're really talking about. Well, the back door could be a man trap, could it not? And one of the things that you want to do with this is to try to prevent some of the tailgating, so that people use credentials only one at a time, goes into a specific area. You could do that with cameras and badges and scan badges, where you scan at the first door, open the first door, go in, and then you have to scan to open the second door, and you could have somebody with a camera watching to see if 2 people came in at the same time. Video surveillance, closed circuit TV. We have one, and no, it's not set up to watch the classes. It's set up for specific security monitoring, and it actually has been used for a couple of times. Things have gone missing. Somebody leaves their purse in the break area and it walks away. Don't take it. Somebody leaves their laptop laying on the table and it walks away. You can go back and see those things. And to save disk space, the recording actually only activates when there's motion. So they're a motion sensor as well as a camera. They sense motion in the area and then starts recording to the hard drive. Otherwise, if you recorded 24 hours a day, it'd fill the hard drives up pretty quickly. Small domes, and that's kind of what we are. If you look right in front of the knock is one of the cameras. You can look right there. They're pretty obvious where they are. There's one by the back door, one in the break area, and one up front, up here by financial aid, one by the knock, and that's about it. Physical access log, list of individuals who entered the secure area. And what a lot of people do is they have the physical access log, you got to sign in, but they're not really so precise with you signing out. Do they have a physical access log when you take a certification test? Yeah, you sign in, you sign out. This would tell you if anybody was still in the building, obviously. That didn't work there. Who had access? So, access control. What's access control, Sam? Tell me control and access. I have to start over. What do we want to do with access control?
Authorization.
Authorization. What can you get to? What do you have to use to get to a specific resource? It could be physical, get in the building, get in the room, or it could be logical, access control with different objects. Get access to files, folders, printers, those sorts of things. Questions? Going once, going twice. I didn't figure. You ready to take a break?
Yeah.